Takla Landing is an unincorporated locality and former steamboat landing on the east side of Takla Lake. It's in the Omineca Country in British Columbia's central interior. During the Omineca Gold Rush, approximately 1869 to 79, Takla Landing was a port for steamboats connecting trails from Hazelton and Babine Lake to trails leading from Takla Landing eastward to the gold strikes on the lower Omineca River. Inhabitants include the Takla Lake First Nation, 320 kilometers north of Prince George. The community was isolated until the 1950s when forestry entered the area. Now it is accessible through Fort St. James on paved and unpaved forestry roads. Alternatively, there is summer access via Germansen Landing on unpaved road. Typical Takla Landing weather warms up in May with average highs of 15 degrees Celsius. Evenings can be near freezing. Summer temperatures average in the 20s and stretch across long days. Autumn is in the air by September. While days are still usually mild, evenings can drop to freezing. Snow blankets interior areas from mid-November through mid-March. A rich environment of lakes, rivers, forests, and mountains, it is bordered on the west by the Skeena Mountains, on the east by the Rocky Mountains. Forestry and tourism, especially outdoor recreation, are the main economic activities. The first aircraft to land at Takla Landing was a Junkers. It had been purchased from Imperial Oil in Edmonton in July 1922 by a Hazelton group, the Railway Employees Investment Association. The aircraft was flown throughout the Omineca district on prospecting forays with the notorious Indigenous guide Simon Gunanoot as navigator. In 1929, First World War Royal Flying Corps ace Donald McLaren was reported to have flown 3 prospectors from Lake Kathleen to Takla Lake in another Junkers F-13. This aircraft, flown by Paddy Burke, would go missing in the upper reaches of the Liard River in the Yukon during October 1930. The Air Land Manufacturing Company of Vancouver owned both Junkers. On November 13, 1930, one arrived at Takla Landing to join the search for Burke. After refueling at Takla Landing, pilots Bill Jorce and Robert Vanderbilt, with engineer Ted Cressy, took off for Dease Lake. An hour into the flight, they ran into a heavy snowstorm and flew northeast to Tudati Lake, where they stayed until weather improved. The next morning, an inch of ice covered the lake. Attempts to break the ice for a takeoff failed. Jorce decided to strip the aircraft to bare essentials and fly out alone, taking off on the ice. His plan worked. He took off for Takla Landing, where he arranged for 2 Indigenous guides to visit Tutati Lake and bring Vanderbilt and Cressy out. Jones then flew to Burns Lake in Vancouver. Without skis, the Junkers was useless at that time of year. The rescue party missed the stranded pair. They had secured other guides and hiked to Takla Landing. There they got a canoe and made their way to Fort St. James, where they arrived December 19, 1930. Eventually, the Burke party's Junkers and its passengers were found, but Burke had died. The aircraft was salvaged, undamaged. It was flown south with pilots Jorsen Vanderbilt and engineer Kading, leaving Atlin on February 23, 1931. Later, they landed at Dease Lake and Telegraph Creek. There it remained until the 28th, when they departed for Fort St. James, but did not arrive. 2.5 hours after takeoff, engine trouble forced them down on the Driftwood River north of Bulkley House at the northwest end of Takla Lake. The aircraft was undamaged. It was pulled high onto the riverbank until engine repairs could be made. At Trembler Lake, they had been supplied with horses to complete their journey. On June 5, 1931, the Airland Manufacturing Company again dispatched a salvage crew. Pilot Bill McCluskey, engineer Ted Cressy, and helper Len Fraser. The trio drove from Vancouver to Fort St. James with a set of floats and engine repair parts. They arrived at Fort St. James June 8th. The crew built a raft using the Junkers floats and hired a small boat to tow it to the beached Junkers, which they reached 4 days later. The float fittings were not compatible, so it was rafted back to Fort St. James. McCluskey, Cressy, and Fraser decided to install wheels on the Junkers. After a search for a suitable takeoff area at Fort St. James, they decided to use 2 tennis courts near the Hudson's Bay store, which would allow departure over Stuart Lake. With this extremely short runway, McCluskey decided he would strip the aircraft to bare essentials and fly to Vanderhoof, where the others could join him on his flight back to Vancouver. His takeoff was uneventful. Half an hour later, he phoned from Vanderhoof for the others to join him with their truck. Grant McConaughey's Independent Airways of Edmonton was on the verge of bankruptcy. But in 1932, a chance meeting with mining promoter Barney Phillips would change this. Phillips had a map indicating a lost gold mine near Two Brothers Lake, later known as Two Doggone Lake. Phillips hired McConaughey to fly his last airplane, a de Havilland DH-80 Puss Moth, with Phillips and 3 prospectors into the lake in the spring of 1933. McConaughey had logged little more than 700 hours of flight time, all over prairie flatlands. But Phillips directed him to fly west through the Rockies. The aircraft landed at Burns Lake for supplies, then north to Takla Landing. Here they refueled and, to lighten the load, dropped off their engineer. The route then took them deeper and deeper into the remote mountainous terrain near the headwaters of the Stikine River. Following the gold map, they flew northwest along the Driftwood River to Bear Lake and along the upper reaches of the Omineca River to Tutati Lake, and then followed a series of creeks until Phillips pointed down to Two Brothers Lake. McConaughey landed the ski-equipped Puss Moth in deep powder snow, burying it up to the wing struts. Even at full power, it would not move. Phillips and McConaughey spent hours on snowshoes, beating down some semblance of a runway for a takeoff. Meanwhile, the aircraft's engine had been left running, as it had a record of not starting. They hoped for enough fuel to make a safe return to Takla Landing. McConaughey was able to make the return flight to Takla and a further 7 flights with supplies and 3 miners. The arrangements between Phillips and McConaughey proved successful, and a new company, United Air Transport was formed to provide transportation to the mine. 2 Fokker Universals operated from a forward base at Takla Landing. Supplies were brought from Fort St. James to Takla by barge during ice-free months, and in winter months, supplies were airlifted from Burns Lake, some 90 miles to the south. In 1936, United Air Transport began flying mail from Prince George to Fort St. James and on to Takla Landing. This was flown by McConaughey, Sheldon Luck, and Ginger Coote. Coote's own airline was in the process of amalgamating with United Air Transport. Pilot Russ Baker, an employee of Coote, soon arrived in a de Havilland DH-83 Foxmoth. However, Baker left the company, accepting an offer from Canadian Airways to operate a base at Fort St. James, first with the Fairchild FC-2W2, later with a Yonkers W-34. In 1934, Pan American Airways subsidiary, Pacific Alaska Airways, began buying out smaller Alaska-based airlines in anticipation of a planned expansion within the state. In 1936, Pan Am began planning a scheduled service from Seattle to Alaska via the BC Interior and Yukon. Facilities were planned at Dog Creek, Prince George, Smithers, Takla Lake, Dease Lake, and Whitehorse. At Whitehorse, the service would connect with the Juneau to Fairbanks run. A communication station and weather reporting facilities were to be set up at Prince George, Takla Lake, and Dease Lake to provide information to Pan Am aircraft on the route. Pan Am applied for a Canadian license to operate a company radio station at both Takla Landing and Dease Lake. The request was denied. Pan Am President Juan Tripp then contacted Yukon Southern Air Transport President Grant McConaughey, who applied for the license under Yukon Southern's name. Then it was approved. Pan Am began using these facilities in 1937 when Pan Am's Lockheed 10A Electra and Boeing 247 passenger airliners flew over Takla Landing and Dease Lake. After Canada declared war against the Axis powers in 1939, the Royal Canadian Air Force began to develop aviation facilities in northern Canada. Amber Route 61 was a military airway between Prince George in British Columbia and Teslin in the Yukon. The first navigational aid northbound on this route was the Takla radio beacon. The United States entered the Second World War, and a significantly larger number of aircraft began using the route. On September 17, 1943, a detachment of 4 men of the U.S. Army's Army Airways Communications Squadron and 4 from the 16th Weather Squadron took over the facilities and operations of the Takla Landing Station from Pan Am personnel. These quarters were lavish compared to those of other remote stations manned by this squadron. There were 2 married couples' quarters, 1 for bachelors, an operations building, and a building for a power plant. All were equipped with a wood stove for heat and cooking. All had running water. The station was supplied by barge from Fort St. James by a United States Army Norseman on floats or skis, depending on the season. In September of 1942, although some reports say 1943, A consolidated Model 16 Commodore was sold by the Aircraft Exporting Company of New York to Alaska Star Airlines. The Commodore was to be ferried there through central British Columbia. The Commodore was a large flying boat. It could accommodate up to 22 passengers and a crew of 3. It was powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney Hornet radial engines of 575 horsepower each. It had a fuel capacity of 650 U.S. gallons, which gave it a range of 1,000 miles. The Commodore was registered in the United States in April 1930 to the New York, Rio, and Buenos Aires line. It was named Puerto Rico. Ownership passed to Pan Am Airlines in September 1930 after Juan Trippe, president of Pan Am, forced a hostile takeover. The aircraft then served with Chamberlain Airlines of Miami, Florida, until April 1942, when it passed to the Aircraft Exporting Company of New York, which sold it to Alaska Star Airlines. During September 1942, NC 664M arrived on Stuart Lake at Fort St. James, where it refueled and departed northwest for its next refueling at Takla Landing. It was again refueled at the Pan Am facility. During the process, it caught fire. The aircraft was pushed away from the dock, but the fire was so intense that the 6 passengers and crew abandoned it. A boat took them to safety. The aircraft burned to the waterline and sank in 85 feet of water, about 300 feet from shore. The crew and passengers were later picked up by pilot Russ Baker in a Canadian Airways Junkers W-34 and flown to Fort St. James. The United States Army began a survey of possible weather and communication station sites in the Omineca region in July 1944. Lieutenant Wimberly, Regional Engineering Officer, Lieutenant Higgins, 60th Group Army Airways Communication System, and Sergeant Jones, Signal Airways Service, left Edmonton's Cooking Lake on July 11, 1944 in a civilian Norseman on floats, flown by Harry March. The Norseman flew west via Fort St. John to Finlay Forks, where they overnighted due to poor weather in the west. On July 17th, pilot March and his military passengers flew to Tudati Lake. After examining other lakes, they landed on Tudati Lake and took possession of an unused miner's cabin. On the 18th, they made contact with a group of miners who loaned them a boat. On the 19th, they selected a site for the weather station. On July 21st, the Norsemen flew back to Finlay Forks, then to Nelson Forks via Fort Nelson. Today, the community is served by the Takla Landing Water Aerodrome.